Good evening, everybody, and welcome. Thank you very much for joining us this evening. I'm Georgia Krista, Tax Events Coordinator, and it's a great pleasure to welcome you at this evening Tag Talk, New Prospects for Traditional Architecture, Nicholas Boy-Smith in discussion with Samuel Hughes. Thank you also to Nicholas and Samuel for accepting to give us this fantastic talk. Nicholas Boy-Smith is the
Well,
founder.
you don't know it's fantastic. It might turn out to be awful. I mean, you're making an assumption there.
Yes, we hope so.
Yeah, so do
Based
we.
on your reputation.
Oh God, that might be a big mistake.
Nicholas Boy-Smith is the founding chairman of the design practice, town builder and think tank Create Streets, and an influential writer on the design and history of our towns and cities. He was chair of the Office of Place, co-chair of the influential Building Better, Building Beautiful Commission, and the Commissioner of Historic England until 2022. His books include No Free Parking and Heart in the Right Street. He was awarded an MBA for services to design and placemaking in the 2024 New Year's honor list. Dr. Samuel Smith.
Hughes. Definitely Hughes, that one.
It's a research fellow at the University of Oxford. He worked as Roger Scruton research assistant on the Building Better, Building Beautiful Commission, and has since worked on built environment policy with Policy Exchange, Create Streets, the Office for Place, and the Center for Policy Studies. I would like to hand over to our guest now, but not before making the usual announcements. After the talk, we will have a session of questions and answers. If you have questions during the talk, please type your questions on the message bar at the bottom of the screen. And after the talk, I will invite you to unmute your microphones and ask your questions directly. So now, Nicholas and Samuel, the stage is yours, please.
Thank you for a very kind introduction, Georgia. So I think what we will do is, discuss a range of themes about the position of traditional architecture around the world today and a lot of the interesting new directions that are taking place. Nicholas is obviously the main attraction. So I'll
on the contrary,
act as his interviewer, but we might go both ways a little bit. And yes, should we? Do we want to start? I think probably most of the audience will know about the work of Create Streets a bit, but maybe not everyone. Do you want to start by telling us a little bit about the background for what Create Streets has done, and then we can move on to some of the contemporary priorities.
Thank you, Samuel, and hello everyone. Thank you very much for giving up a bit of your evening. It's a great pleasure to be here, and Samuel, as ever, it's a huge pleasure to be in discussion with you, and virtually, not in real life. So what I thought I'd just do was do a quick scamper through in a couple of minutes, just what Create Streets is, what we try and do, and why and how. Now, I apologize because I do recognize some of the names on the screen, so I know some of you will know that, but I think some of you won't. Hopefully, it is helpful. We are a bit of a sui generis organization, which is a pompous and Latin way for saying that there's nothing quite like us, I think, elsewhere in the world. Just a word about myself first. So, I mean, Georgia, you're very, very kind, a bit too generous. This is very much my second career. I set up Create Streets just over a decade ago, basically out of irritation with the really rubbish placemaking and buildings and design and development that I saw in London as, I was going to say young father, I guess a father of young children. And a couple of you heard the story. I mean, it literally came from driving past some regeneration of a post-war estate and just being puzzled as to why it was so bad and not understanding why, and getting a bit curious and annoyed, if I'm honest, and going to speak to someone who was quite intimately and at quite a senior level involved with that program, and his inability to fully explain to me why it was so bad, and his inability to answer my questions as to where people wanted to live. And it seemed to me sort of strange that a man who was in quite a powerful position in redesigning a large bit of London didn't seem to know the answers to that, or frankly to think they were very important. And that, as they say in vernacular English, pissed me off. And so I'm afraid that's what led to all this. So I've got a couple of slides, forgive me, hang on, let me just try and share those. We really should be very good at this, shouldn't we, after after all these years. Hopefully, oh crikey, what's going on there? No, it's gone into, why has that not gone into full screen?
That's fine.
Hang on, it's not letting me go make into, there we go. Hopefully that is now full screen. Sorry, my computer's going a bit slow this evening. Can you all see that?
Yes.
Cool. So this is actually from a project we're currently doing or just started in the Middle East. What I thought, I mean, I won't say it now, but I think there is a quiet rebirth taking place in the creation and the stewardship of traditional places and buildings. And I think in different ways that's a theme we will come back to. But just quickly, with apologies to those who know this, so Great Streets, we are a social enterprise with an associated charity. And we are based here in London. In fact, I'm speaking to you from our office in Lambeth Walk, which for those of you who know your English history will know was actually quite an important Cockney high street in South London, which then got visited by the Germans in the 1940s and suffered a little bit from that, and then got visited by the post-war rebuilders and suffered much more from that. So it's a street that's had a tough time. At our heart, we do research into the built environment. Where are people happy? Where do they like to be? Where will they pay more to live? Why do we create the places we do? How do we enhance public well-being? And as much as possible, because we still find it's useful, and I have a pile of them here, we try and print them. So this is our latest, I think it's our latest report. This is one we did with the British Beer and Pubs Association, which was a very popular report in the office as to how do you create places in which pubs, bars, cafes can thrive. Because actually that's a very good metaphor, as any of you who spend any time in the English-speaking world will know, for a good place. If you can make a pub work, the place is working. So we try and come at the angle time after time from different ways with new data, new research, and above all, not, forgive me to all the architects and planners listening, not actually primarily talking to architectural planners. We're primarily interested in talking to politicians, to public officials, to decision makers, and we try and talk in language that builds coalitions and alliances. So this paper here, Move Free, is very much looking, if you like, at the pragmatic, one might almost say the empirical or conservative case for more public transport and for more cycles. If you like, making an argument that may seem in some circumstances, I wouldn't see it as such, but some would see as left-wing to perhaps a more right-wing audience. Again, I wouldn't quite categorize it like that, but one might. This was a big report we did a bit over a year ago into why it's rational to plant street trees and to have greenery in the public realm. It is, by the way. We then put a lot of focus into trying to get that into the national media, not the media that speaks to architects, but the media that speaks to the general public. And you can see here, just because I just put it in the middle of this page, a coverage of our recent report into how to double the size of Cambridge. One of the themes that runs through a lot of our work, and we can probably come back to that, again, very much about trying to talk to the wider public, is what I think I'm not sure if we've coined the phrase, we've certainly popularized it, what we call gentle density, which we think gets many of the advantages of propinquity and sustainable development map patterns of not needing to build all out into the countryside, but also some of the advantages of personal space, of liberty, of control over your own environment that comes with a house or with slightly lower densities. And so I think it's a really interesting sort of mini case study. You look at some of the London and other planning documents in this country a few years ago, they were making an absolutely unambiguous, unadulterated case for the advantages of density. And there are advantages of density, but there are also disadvantages, and that just wasn't being made at all. So we've tried to lean into that. We're then very interested in how you advocate for that, how you try and bring that to life visually. We shamelessly use images. We shamelessly talk about beauty. This is from some of our work on the future of Cambridge. And we then try and work with a wide range of people on the centre right and the centre left. This is from a conference we ran last year. I think it was last year. Yes, it was in Coventry. This is actually on the left. Is one of, I think it is England's largest remaining medieval guild hall. No one knows it's there because Coventry got blown to bits other than this. And we ran that with Labour Together, a centre-left think tank, and they're actually the man on the left-hand side of that image on the right is now in the cabinet, and also with UK Onward, a centre-right think tank. We then do master planning. Many of you on the call will know about master planning. These are some of our plans. We write design codes. We've got that much more firmly into the English planning system. There are still many councils doing them badly or not doing them at all, but it is now possible for English councils, if they wish to, increasingly they are, to code for beautiful and popular streets and places. And we're working with a growing range of councils who are interested in what the public like and wish to give that visual form in planning policy. And in almost everything we do, we try and seek to, in fact, I hope in everything, we try and seek to capture what the public like, either by running offline, as in here, sort of market stall style events, or online. This is from a street code we've done in Surrey. We don't just think that what buildings look like matters, though it does. Street design matters, street trees, continuous crossings, tightening enclosure ratios, and increasingly we're now getting into the real detail of designing that. So we've got a growing team of street designers who do that. And then we're very interested in how you regenerate places, how you get places growing, if you like, centripetally, not centrifugally, spinning in and regenerating and reviving themselves. I hope this isn't too fast. It's deliberately a little bit speedy. We can obviously come back to some of these themes. Again, I'm not sure if we've pioneered, but we've certainly popularized a process we call visual preference surveys, which we've run in several countries. Where we do is, it's just basically A/B testing, where you ensure, ideally, that only one thing is different in the two images. And we use that to test buildings, presence of street trees, street width, quality of urban furniture. I mean, I can tell you now, I don't think I've got a slide on this, I probably should do. In most studies, I think I can probably say in all studies, between 70 and 90% of people prefer a more articulated, traditional, and coherently complex set of buildings. That they're not quite saying it has to look like it was done in 1835. Sorry if that annoys some of the people on the call, but they are saying they appreciate variety in a pattern, embedded symmetries, biomorphic forms, something that feels as if it's of this place and has texture. That's working with our friend Francis Terry. We do lots of co-design, and here's from our online platform, which I do recommend use. It's very cheap to use, which allows the public, and we can get hundreds, if not sometimes thousands of responses very quickly to map and say which places they like and they don't like. And that is, we found in several cases, transformational in planning policy and then in setting what can actually get built. Just, I mean, maybe this is self-indulgent. We're really proud and pleased. I think we're increasingly working outside the UK. So we've recently been working in Benghazi, looking at this place here, working with a set of residents and a set of professionals resident in Benghazi as to how to improve that place. And as several of you possibly know, in fact, I recognise one person on the call that's been involved, we are growing an increasing education programme. Now, as we begin to change the planning system, though much more to do, I think we're increasingly interested in how we create the young architects and planners and investors and urban designers who not only dare to care about the beauty and the lovability of places, but actually are technically able to do it as well. This is from the summer school that we run in Sherborne. Currently still looking for places. There's still places available if anyone's interested. Do go to the Creative Streets Foundation website, forgive the plug. These are images from last year, which we ran, and as we will be this year, with our good friends at Adam Architecture. This is literally from a few days ago. We also run a range of 1-day and 2-day courses, growing quite fast. Do have a look at our shop. Here's our office in Lambeth Walk in central London. This is from the Gentle Density Masterclass that we were running literally just a few days ago. And we're now working in Ukraine. So we've been working with, thanks to charitable funding, looking at the future, at the rebuilding of Ukraine. If you like, we're a counterweight, I hope, we're certainly going to try to be, to the Starchitects coming in and perhaps trying to think of a glossy future. We're certainly trying to empower residents of Ukraine and citizens who've perhaps got a slightly different vision for their country. And then just a couple of last slides. This is from a housing development in Devon that we recently got planning permission for. We took up the density by about 30% by asking people what they liked, and by doing that and going from a drive-to cul-de-sac to just creating terraced houses and semi-detached around a village green. And this is from a project we're very proud of, actually, which is still ongoing in Lichfield, where we've been asking people what they like. We've been mapping that, and we've been using that to set a growing now series of site-specific design codes for land that council owns, to empower the development of that, and that's now moving forward with a pattern book of house types, and that's the infill development that we're working on there. I'm going to jump over that. I just want to quickly touch on this, and this is perhaps an important point for many of you. We don't regard traditional architecture as the outcome. We regard it as one of the tools that is often the right tool to use in trying to get a good virtuous circular place, a place in which people want to live, to work, to spend time with sufficient housing supply. There are many necessary steps on the way to achieve that. We can share some of these slides later, in which we'll set out some of those. But it's not just about what buildings look like, that's important. It's about streets, it's about morphology, it's about real middles, it's mixing uses, it's about gentle density, it's greenery, making it easy to move in a multiplicity of ways, and then above all, beautiful well, not above all, but certainly critically beautiful buildings and streets and restitching towns. Again, good news, a growing number of towns across the UK, and I think elsewhere, we'll come to that later, are now starting to think about how they can restitch their town centres, how they can take out the box land that have been created over the last 50 years and put back in terraces and blocks with clear backs and fronts. This is a project we're working on right now in the north of England, and this is another one which actually is on pause at the moment, but which I'm hoping will go forward. That is all I'm going to say now. Sorry, that was probably a bit longer than it should have been, but I hope that gives a sense of what we're up to. Samuel, back to you. I'll shut up for a bit.
Yeah, well, you've talked a lot about building alliances, talked a lot about building a kind of political coalition for traditional architecture, might be putting it too narrowly, but for Create Streets' approach. That's maybe a good starting point for the first thing we should talk about, which is the political situation in the UK and how that's changed the landscape for, or if it's changed the landscape for urbanism. So you worked pretty closely with several of the Conservative Secretaries of State, with Robert Jenrick, Michael Gove. But you've also done a fair bit of work with the current government. Although, on the other hand, the current government has rolled back on some of the measures that the preceding government put into place. So I get asked about this a lot. People say, you know, is Labour anti-beauty? Are they getting rid of all of the stuff that Gove brought in? Is it a very, you know, bleak situation? I tend to say no, not really. It's a more complicated, maybe a more hopeful situation than that. But since you're closer to the coalface on this, I'm kind of interested about what your experience has been, how you think the relatively, I'd say, new government or nearly new government, what its outlook is on these themes, and what you think, you know, the how successful you think the exercise in building a broad coalition and like depoliticizing this issue has been.
Thank you, and I will answer, but only on the principles that you give me more of your views at the end afterwards, because I think your perspective is quite close to the coalface, with all due respect, Samuel. So a couple of quick thoughts. First thoughts would be, and I touched on this before, but just to expand the point, and before we get actually into the, if you like, the high politics of the different UK governments. In all the polls we've done in this country, and also in polls done in other countries, when you've got a sufficiently wide base of respondents to give confident views about different demographics and segments, it cannot be overstressed that views on architecture and place are not a divider between left and right. I think that's an incredibly important point to make, and obviously relevant to how politicians then respond. You know, in polls we've done, people who vote Conservative, people who vote Labour, people who vote Lib Dem, people who vote Reform, and for those non-UK residents, those are people with very different political views on almost everything else, perhaps not quite as divergent as Democrats and Republicans, but, you know, in some cases verging on it. They basically agree within a few percentage points of the type of place they like, and you get similar splits by age and by views on Brexit and by socioeconomic demographic. So point one is, at least some politicians on both sides have read those polls, and I know for a fact at least some of the key advisors have. So, you know, on the whole, politicians don't vote for Christmas. So I think it is true that the previous government put in lots of hooks, both, if you like, philosophically and practically, to make it easier for local councils to demand popular, beautiful places, and critically, to allow local councils to create ways of measuring that through the visual pattern books that we were talking about earlier, and indeed increase the pressure to do that. They also, through the Levelling Up and Regeneration Act 2023, the previous government, actually required councils to start doing that, though critically the secondary legislation for that wasn't actually made. They also started creating, as some of you who live in the UK will know, a small non-departmental public body called the Office for Place, if you like, to popularise the use of some of those mechanisms, which I was chairing. So the bad news, that Office for Place was, and I with it, was defenestrated late last year. it was interesting because it was a surprise. So We Create Streets have been putting a lot of time and thought into our interactions with the then Labour opposition before the last election. We'd been very careful, and always have in the way we've approached it, been careful to have political advisors and friends on both sides of the political divide. I think it's not a secret to say that people who used to be Create Streets fellows are now in the Labour ministry advising the Minister of Housing. That's a matter of public record. And we actually helped them work on some of their views, as you know, Samuel, on Greenbelt policy, on some of their views on new towns. And indeed, we produced a document for the Labour Party, which was published. Indeed, it was splashed prominently in the Times, to the irritation of some of the bien-pensants a few months before the election. And actually, then the new government committed to the keeping of the office place. And indeed, we were busy out recruiting. So it all felt that it was sailing relatively fair, and that given that context of the desperate need for new housing, which I think the current government is very, very good on, very strong on that, it all felt fine. We fell foul of two things, but I don't think it is systemically problematic, but perhaps it creates a few storms. One is that Michael Gove, the previous Secretary of State, made a mistake in taking housing or reducing the importance of housing targets in the system. And I think, in my view, quite rightly, the new government wanted to reverse that. And in doing so, they also pledged to reverse all his recent changes to the planning system. So a whole bunch of edits, some of which, in my view, were very helpful in terms of increasing the pressure on quality in a deliverable and predictable way. Thus, some of those fell out as well. Interestingly, I think they were surprised by, and that did remove half a dozen references to beauty and to good placemaking. It didn't actually remove the key ones that had already gone in about a year and a half earlier under Robert Jenrick. I think they were quite, this is my speculation, I don't actually know this, I think they were quite surprised by the amount of criticism they got from that. Not, I should say, from me. And interestingly, in their defense, they then did a short public statement, which was also picked up in the media, saying, well, we're not taking beauty out of the planning system. We're just removing some of the additional references that Michael Gove put in recently. But as a key principle of what we should create is absolutely key. That is an absolute, I mean, you might argue the word beauty in itself isn't important, but that is a game changer and very, very different from the situation 4 or 5 years ago, when certainly architects and many planners, when it was first mooted by Roger and I and a few others, were very dismissive of the concept. But I think it's fair to say that, maybe I'm tempting fate here, but the Overton window has moved slightly on that. And I'd also add a final thing, and then I'll ask you what you think, Samuel. In some issues of transport planning, hopefully of trams, and thinking about the role of the motor car in traditional settlements or new gentle density settlements, I think some of the things the government is both saying conceptually and actually doing in the planning system in terms of how we model future motor car use is actually incredibly important. And bluntly, it was something the previous government wouldn't do. So no, I remain very glass half full on this.
There were Create Streets proposals that entered the recent NPPF, right?
Yes, we lost some and we gained some. So it was a double bay loading system. We got things in and some things were removed. But I think on balance, you'd always like the situation to be a little bit better, but I think we're reasonably comfortable, and we've got a good ongoing conversation with some bits of the government.
Yeah.
Would you agree with that? Am I being too rosy? I'm a slightly glass half full sort of guy, so maybe I'm being too rosy.
I think so. I mean, the nature of politics is, if you're advocated for by one side, you automatically create risks and incentives. I mean, politicians have no choice but to attack each other. That is literally their job when they're in opposition. It's very difficult to endorse an agenda that your opponents have introduced while they were in government, and very difficult to say, oh yeah, great, we love them. These guys are really have some brilliant ideas that they're adding to the country.
By the way, vote for me.
Yeah, right. By the way, vote for me. Literally not doing their job. So, under those circumstances, the fact that there's been the foot's gone off the pedal in certain areas, some minor references have come out of some paragraphs or some documents, whatever. But basically, they're still sympathetic to the agenda. There's been absolutely no hostile language from Secretary of State or the Housing Minister in the sense of, we're opposed to this generally, these are bad people, we don't want this. They're still broadly on side. I mean, that's, under the circumstances, a very good situation to be in, I think.
I mean, their voters, just like voters to the other parties, are basically supportive of lovable places. And I think that's what we're going to keep trying to demonstrate, which is, this is not a weird, or, I mean, it isn't elite or obscure or divisive to want to create places in which people are happy and speak to their friends and their neighbors more. And that's something we agree on. So I think if we can keep stressing that point, demonstrating it empirically on the ground, then I think, rational politicians hopefully won't turn against that. Some obviously will, but I think we should be able to take the majority with us. I'm daring to. There'll be different nuances. So I think it'll be perhaps easier for politicians on the right to speak about beauty, ? Perhaps easier for politicians on the left to speak about greening up or about sustainable development patterns, because obviously their audiences will respond perhaps a little bit more verbally. Certainly their friends and their opinion forming audiences. And so I think there will be differences, and I think we're comfortable with that. And one of the reasons we don't, as I say, Create Streets is not actually a traditional architecture organization. We're a happy and prosperous and healthy places organization. And we see that buildings and streets that people like is, one of the critical paths to achieve that. They will very often be either traditional or traditional adjacent. But some communities may want something more brutal and assertive. And up to a point, well, not up to a point. If that's what they want, that they should have it. I don't think the majority will, based on all the polling and all the research, but some will, and that's fine. I hope that's not causing huge offence to the traditional architecture group. I apologise if it is.
Let's talk about the international situations. I've just actually, the invitation was for tomorrow. I think I got a very gracious invitation from the diocese of the Basilican Church at Saint Denis, where just tomorrow they're laying the foundation stone for completing one of the 2 towers of the West Front. It fell down in a fire in the 19th century and has been a stump ever since. And now they finally got together the resources, and it's going to be rebuilt over the next few years. Quite an extraordinary structure. So that's and I unfortunately couldn't get to Paris for tomorrow, although I would very much like to have gone to have seen that. So that reminded me of a lot of the work that's going on certainly in France, the country I know somewhat, and Germany, a country I know quite well. You've been in France just recently, I think. What's your read on the situation there?
Well, I think in a way this is, and actually, at least some of our French friends I know are on the call. The amount of high quality work taking place outside the Anglophone world, I think, is absolutely astonishing. Actually, I think it's very easy not to be aware of it. Actually, neither you or I are complete monoglots, but it's very easy to live in an Anglophone bubble and not to appreciate that across Germany, across Holland, an increasing number of places in France, sometimes, and I've got some slides on this which we can come to shortly, but sometimes at scale, sometimes just an infill building here or there, there's just more and more good urbanism taking place. Often by architects, English people haven't heard of, and it's not just a European phenomenon. I was also in the Middle East recently. I hadn't fully appreciated the degree to which traditional urbanism and architecture is making a comeback in the Middle East. It's still, I think, a minority sport, but it's definitely growing in popularity. I've got a couple of slides on that. Is that okay if I show that? So I don't want to do. I promise we won't do death by PowerPoint, if only because I didn't have time to sort of upload all the ones I wanted to. But I'll just where is it? I think that will be it coming up with that. Hopefully that will work. Has that come up? That was the one I had before. So let me just go on. So just a couple of slides, and then we can go back to chatting. So this is it's not much to look at, but that construction on the left is only a couple of years old, and it's in a town in the Middle East where they basically, I can't say where because I'm going to show you a few pictures of it. They basically completely destroyed the town centre, the traditional town centre, in the 1970s and early 1980s. And increasingly, individual landowners are starting to put it back. Here's a little case study for you. These 2 photos were taken about 10 minutes apart, perhaps 15 minutes. The beautiful thing on the left is inside a 1980s shopping mall, which was almost deserted at about 9 o'clock at night a few weeks ago. Other than a couple of individual structures in very bad state, there's only one bit of the traditional bit of this city still surviving, which is a bit outside the ring road, a one-way ring road that strangles the city centre. You can see a photo of that.
It's strangely familiar, doesn't it?
Yeah, it's and what was staggering as me and my colleagues were walking around was how the themes we were talking about and the factors were so familiar to us. The sort of the de-seaming of the cities, not just the ripping down of the old buildings, but literally the loss of the street pattern. The city centre completely given over to parking, which is just empty half the time, just over wide spaces, heartless, ugly, faceless modernist architecture that was no more at home in the Middle East than it is in France or America or Scotland. And the people voting with their feet. And this, we didn't set this photo up. It was just, it just did itself to us. And we'd been wandering around and trying to talk to people. It was only in this bit of the town that people came and spoke to us, and we ended up having lots of chats with children. And we had a really nice 20 minutes. It was lovely, and it was safe. There were no cars. It was quite cool. The wind beautifully, because it's, as so often with traditional architecture, it responds incredibly cleverly to the climate. So lots of little wind tunnels were created, which of course in the Middle East is something you want. And I hadn't realized until we were there, and this is a CGI, just how much of this stuff is now being planned. So all over the place, all over in Doha, in Dubai, in the Gulf states. This is an image of Dira in Saudi Arabia. Now, interestingly, I think tellingly, most of it is high-end luxury. It is different from what was there before. What was there before didn't have water, didn't have electricity, didn't have very big windows. Don't necessarily want those in this climate, and tiny homes. So it's being reimagined in a slightly different way, bluntly, much nicer. Is it a Roger Scruton quote? It feels like it could be something like they took a beauty away from us and resold it as luxury, or resold it to us as luxury. I think that's a Roger Scruton line. Nothing encapsulates that dilemma better than what we're seeing happening in the Middle East. But I'm daring to be hopeful that what starts as a luxury sport hopefully will become more widespread. And I want to tell, it's not a very good imitation. I will come to Dresden later, and you all, I'm sure, know that the story of Dresden. I assume you do, but here's a thing. You'll all know, I think, that this is all reproduction over the last 25 years, an incredibly successful story. One of our clients in the Middle East has visited Dresden a few years ago. Literally, I think as he arrived, didn't know the full story of Dresden. As he was there, he realized, and it was explained to him, that everything he was seeing is, early 21st century. And this is the point, he's a man in his, I think, late 50s, very early 60s. So he remembers his city in the Middle East before it was denatured. And this was the moment that gave him the confidence, almost the insight, to think, crikey, although he presumably put it in Arabic, we don't have to live like this. We can do this back. So I think this is quite powerful. Here's Dresden, a town in Saxony, telling a story, 1,000 miles away in the Middle East. And I'll give you one more instance of this, and then I'll just scamper for you a couple more slides. I think it's not too personal to say that my parents also visited Dresden last year, having never visited before. My father, whom I love dearly and admire, has always regarded my views on rebuilding old places and reusing sometimes old architectural forms as a little bit eccentric. He's a man now in his late 70s. As we get older, I think the data suggests it gets harder for us to change our minds. My father changed his mind on a view he's held since his 20s, having visited Dresden, which is actually, a horrible thing to admit. His son's quite right. This is exactly what we should be doing. And this is just clearly a better place to be and to visit and to love and to spend time in. My mother had no such, troubles, and she just shamelessly came back saying it's absolutely gorgeous. This is exactly what we should be doing. So when we have, well, say we, I'm not implicated at all, but to anyone on the call who is, these successes concatenate in ways you might never imagine. A couple in Middle England changing their views, a town in the Middle East which hopefully will be put back in a different pattern, a different language, but nevertheless following the same principles. These are some of the first images for that town in the Middle East, which we're starting to work on. Again, exactly those same patterns of just utterly denatured on the left, hopefully coming back to something more human as we get going. And we're starting to put together a pattern book. And amazingly, perhaps not amazing at all, actually, following from the Quran, and again, as many on the call will doubtless know, the patterns there to repeat and to recreate are incredibly easy to do. There's also, I think, increasingly in the UK, the rise of what you might call polite modern vernacular, interestingly, often not done by traditional architectural practices. So these are guys who are quite active on social media. They're not traditionalists. Some of their, yeah, it's exactly. It's Ollie Smithwaite. Some of their buildings are very modernist. Some like this are, I suspect some on the call won't quite like it and would like a little bit more texture and detail. But hecking, this is a heck of a lot better than what's there right now. I think we can all agree. And we're just seeing more and more of
working
this.
with very tight budgets a lot of the time as well.
Absolutely.
Right? They're not usually working in places with masses of land value that they can dip into.
That's Roussillon Park done by Ben Pentreath, who doubtless
I think probably did have a fair bit of land value they could dip into.
Absolutely, but interesting. It's not done in a sort of pure traditionalist graphic. Some of you will know this is an example I've used a lot over the years. This is in Merton, South London. So there is land value here, and they've actually kept the old modernist building and refaced it in. I mean, I think any word you like to describe that. Is it modern? Is it sort of terracotta chic? I don't know what you want to call it. It's not quite traditional, but it's certainly got many of the features and the texture and the form and the variety within a pattern that we know most people like. I just quickly, but then we're just seeing more and more of this. This is actually one that my colleague Robert's brought to my attention recently. This is a proposed restitching of part of Prague in a completely traditional block pattern. Dresden we've talked about, I think, but again, it's not just the buildings. They are putting the street pattern back. This is one, again, with the low land values in Salford in North England. Again, I think the buildings perhaps would have a little bit more texture in them, but this is a pretty good city making. And then you mentioned France, and just to perhaps to come back to the beginning, I mean, the quality and the range of good traditional block patterns with beautiful faces, some in infill sites, some in rather larger ones, and then back to America now. That was not meant to be there. That's out of order. Forgive me. I'm going to jump over that and just come back. Here's one in England, perhaps a little bit plainer, but I think inoffensive. I think better than inoffensive. And then this is the one I wanted to get to, and I know we've got someone on the call from this. I visited Blaise-Robinson in France for the second time recently. The first time I visited was coming back from my in-laws last summer. Again, I think you've heard this story, Samuel, forgive me. But my younger son, age 14, fell asleep as we were on the way, and woke up as we arrived and looked at this and said, "Is this Paris?" And those were literally his words.
Actually, an estate regeneration project, isn't it?
It is. They've tripled the density. Actually, that's not very good.
Very run-down post-war estate.
With an incredibly impressive mayor, Philippe Pemzac, who's been literally mayor for 30 years. Triple the density, huge increase in land values. And as you go around with him, he quite rightly and very proudly keeps asking you, can you tell which is social housing? C'est ça? C'est celui-là? C'est celui-ci? And of course, you can't tell. In fact, I didn't have time to do my own slides because these are from one of my colleagues. I was hoping to pull up some of my images, but I'm afraid I haven't had time. But I mean, it is absolutely, it's spellbindingly good. There are others. There are Brandenwood, and there's an increasing range of these. And actually, what we Create Streets want to do, I'll stop sharing slides there. What we want to do, I think, is, and people like Ruben Hansen at Aesthetic City are doing this as well, is just to start sharing more and more the stories and give people confidence that this is good for residents, it's good, popular with voters, increases density, increases land values. Ultimately, this is a key one, particularly perhaps for this government in the UK, allows you to provide infrastructure more cheaply and without needing to have 3 cars per home. You can literally create a virtuous circle, and there's just more and more of this happening. So we will be doing another conference for landowners and for council leaders in a few months' time, and that will be the message that you're not on your own doing this. The quiet revolution, I think, is picking up heat here, and people like it.
I have a good story in this connection. So you probably know the background here. In Berlin in the 1990s, after the beautification of the city, the Berlin government, Social Democratic government, put in charge a guy called Hans Stimmann to run the city's planning authority. And he basically reinstated roughly the 19th century building codes. So it's got like stylistically largely neutral, although there were some rules on things like some rules on materials and some rules on the proportion of void to solid and this kind. But reinstating the original street patterns, reinstating the original block structure, and that probably created fertile ground for a lot of traditional practices because it was so easy to do their stuff in that context. And these sort of grid facades, 5 stories high, casement windows, like it's very, very obvious to the familiar typology in which to So these firms started to flourish. And that's continued down to the present day. The current Senatsbaudirektorin is Petra Karfeld, who's a classical architect and was appointed by a coalition of left-wing parties a few years ago. So still doing that work. Now, I got to know this while I was studying in Berlin. And Roger Scruton came to visit me while I was there, and we were walking around the city, and he didn't know Berlin. Interestingly, despite being a lover of German culture, he didn't really know Berlin at all, and was astonished by how much had happened there. I gave him a great deal of confidence, which I think ramified later on for his work on the commission. But it was in the course of that afternoon when I was giving him an architectural tour, he told me, "You ought to work on architecture, Samuel. This is
oh right."
Clearly,
so there you go.
You love this, and you clearly you've learned everything. You can tell me every building and when it was built or rebuilt. So another example of how doing a bit of this encourages more people to get involved.
Yeah, and I think yes, it builds and concatenates, and I think it's fascinating. I don't know Berlin nearly as well as you, and unlike you, I'm not a German speaker, but particularly East Berlin, where I think less damage was done post-war than it was in West Berlin. Certainly, my maybe two trips to Berlin, I ended up preferring East Berlin. Is that fair, or is that unfair?
I think they were both pretty bad in the post-war decades, and a lot of stuff got leveled, and they did keep. Actually, it's kind of sounds a bit like what we were saying earlier about Britain. East German government kept the tram network, which got scrapped in West Berlin, and now is being gradually reinstated. But I think when it came to most kind of architecture and urbanism stuff, from the 50s through to the I don't know 1980 or something,
pretty bad.
Both councils were not wasn't a shining example.
I mean, if I may, forgive me, it's probably going off on a slight tangent, but I think it's probably worth saying because it's probably not something that's foremost in people's minds. Trams are really important for traditional urbanism, and trams are, if you like, they're cheap trains that use the streets rather than expensive buses. And it's really striking. The tram renaissance that is now taking place across Europe, I think, is incredibly important actually to making good urbanism work. Because if you're to live at slightly higher densities, either with one car or possibly with no cars, public transport needs to be really predictable and efficient and effective if it is to be an aspirational way to live. And the great joy of trams is, they use existing infrastructure. They tend to run pretty well to a timetable, and they're really nice and smooth and comfortable. So I think it really matters that, actually come back to the UK, that at the moment we're not doing that nearly as well as we are in much of Europe. There's only one town in the UK that kept its trams in the sort of post-war. Blackpool, exactly. We've just kicked off a project, or just about to kick off a project there, and we've just discovered that the trams are just a few blocks away from the greening up project we'll be working on.
But after all, France was just as bad as us in this respect. They scrapped all of their tram systems, and they just reopened. What, there are about 20 of them now running in. I don't mean 20 trams, 20 tram networks.
I don't actually know the number. I've got it in a project paper somewhere over there. But yes, it's certainly. I mean, Bordeaux I think is probably the most spectacular visually. I mean, I've spotted. I visit Tours quite frequently en route to my in-laws, and the sort of the depth and breadth of the tram network there and its visibility has certainly massively increased over the last 15 years.
We talked a lot about these, relative, like the broadening of the alliance and about depoliticization of traditional architecture, but there is obviously one very important story at the moment, which is in some tension with that, which is what's going on in the United States, where the new Trump administration they haven't yet revived the executive order mandating classical architecture for federal buildings, but there has been an executive order, I think maybe indicating that they're moving in that direction, or indicating.
Yes, I think I forget the name of the proper official, but I think Trump has requested that that the executive order is done within a certain period of time. I think that's the request.
And I think it's. Whatever else one may say about Trump, he's not an uncontroversial figure.
Yes, I think that we can all agree on. I think.
How do you see that playing out? How do you see it affecting debates about traditional architecture around the world?
Well, I mean, again, I'd be interested in your views. The nature of the advocate, as well as what you say and how you say it, really matters. it is important that traditional architecture and traditional placemaking is seen as something that can appeal across the spectrum, understood various ways. I think it's fair to say, this is not a partisan comment, that President Trump probably doesn't seek to do that in his natural demeanor. So I think that's a challenge. I think, friends of mine.
Chuck Marone wrote about this a few years ago. He said, "But brand ambassador, you want
yes.
a low controversy figure. If you're in England, you want David Beckham or Stephen Fry or someone like."
Or the king, actually. I mean, given the choice between the king as a brand ambassador, which is essentially what we've got in the UK with his fantastic work in Poundbury and Lansleden, or President Trump, I think as a Briton, it's okay for me to say I'd choose the former. I think I wrote about this. So just I assume everyone knows this. So at the end of his last presidency, President Trump did an executive order that all new federal buildings should be primarily in the classical or colonial style. I think that's the right wordings, within a sort of sub point that they should be popular. There's been polling done in the States, which comes to the same finding that that it does in the UK or other countries, which actually the vast majority of people would prefer that. Clearly, nevertheless, this is problematic, as the response of classical architects in America showed, with some supporting it and some opposed. That what I wrote at the time, and I would still say now, is actually you don't need to do that. All you need to do is say, well, as in all buildings, let's have public policy that says they should be popular, and then let the people make their view and come to their conclusions. And I think it's quite interesting. We were sort of talking about this briefly earlier, weren't we? Looking at different views of the state in the States, and I was going to say the UK, I think probably all of Europe, one can say, certainly in America, the federal state came into existence at a particular point in time, late 18th, early 19th century, and obviously all of its early buildings were built at that time in a quite self-consciously French-influenced, slightly moving away from the English colonial style into something that was a bit more neoclassical, a bit more assertive, making that link between Republican government and Roman architecture in a way that has obviously understandable historical points. That's just not true, I think, of any. Perhaps it's a little bit true of the French state discussed, but all European states, almost by definition, have a longer history of placemaking, and on the whole, the buildings we associate with them come from a wider range of centuries. I'm just off the top of my head thinking about the UK. House of Parliament is obviously a 19th century neo-Gothic building, but Windsor Castle, one of the premier palaces that the royal family occupy, is essentially medieval with a lot of Regency, interpolation. So perhaps there's sort of something going on there that doesn't happen in Europe. But what do you think on that? You've read on architectural history more than most, probably as much as any. What is that a fair comment, or am I making that fit too neatly?
No, I agree. There's a divergence in. Certainly for federal architecture in the States, there's a very recognizable tradition that runs from the foundation of the Republic up to the 1940s, which shows striking stylistic continuity. And the various moves, the waves that swept across, stylistic waves that swept across Anglophone architecture in that time didn't really touch federal architecture, with a couple of quite marginal exceptions. Whereas the architecture of the British state changed from the foundation of the American Republic through to the 1940s, it changed every 30 years or something. And if you walk up and down Whitehall, it's a parade of the styles that buildings of somewhat variable success, but pretty fascinating. So I think there's some divergence there. Yeah, I think that it's a tricky one. Obviously, I love classical architecture, and I love the American federal classical tradition, and I've certainly no objection to them building classical buildings. I'd be delighted if they do a good job. But there is the way the debate gets framed in the States is like a proxy for wider culture wars. So as the right will see it like, are you in favor of Western civilization or are you against Western civilization? And that's what we think is signified by the classical architecture. And if the left will see, we reject that framing. We want, are you in favor of a modern open society or against a modern open society? And that's what's signified by your support or opposition to classical architecture. And this framing seems like both intrinsically wrong and also extremely unhelpful in the medium term. And we've, you and I, and I think lots of the people in the audience here would always have insisted, the big debate here is about kinds of placemaking that have a demonstrably positive relationship to health, happiness, sustainability, prosperity, popularity.
Absolutely.
And traditional, including classical architecture, is absolutely one way of doing that, like an excellent way, demonstrably good way of doing that. But it's not the only way. Like there are other ways that have been done very well and very successfully. And that.
Oh, have we just lost Samuel? But hopefully he'll come back. I agree with what Samuel was saying, actually, which he was saying with his typical
ecumenical framing, rather than sliding into one that I think is probably going to be, yeah, I mean, could potentially be very unhelpful.
I agree with that. So we lost you there for a moment, but I think we got the gist of your. I mean, made a clear point, made with typical eloquence and clarity. I think I'd just add that, perhaps repeating myself from earlier, I think in that context, and I agree with the challenge it poses, that's why I think it's all the more important to stress. But although they do it in slightly different, very different patterns, we see the same patterns of traditional placemaking across the world, obviously varying by climate, varying by, above all, by materials that are available. But again, just reflecting Middle East is in my mind because I was there a few weeks ago. Yes, you've got mud bricks and you've got different textures, you've got buildings closer together, you've got smaller windows, you've got all these differing responses to climate. But actually, that's comparable to some of the different approach to urbanism that you get in Sicily or you get in Spain versus what you would get in Stockholm. There's similar patterns being played with differently, and I think that's the point to stress. And that different civilizations nevertheless respond in similar ways. And I think we just need to stick to that and encourage our American friends as much as possible to talk about classical buildings and federal buildings and traditional places in some ways. As I think actually you mentioned Charles Morone of Strong Towns. For those who don't know it, I would really actually encourage, have a look at the work of Strong Towns. I think a very interesting organization, a little bit similar to Create Streets, but probably with more of a focus on the economic resilience and sustainability than we typically put. And I think they've been quite thoughtful in their response to some of the slightly heightened debate. But
yeah, I mean, of course, I don't want to be uncharitable about all of our American colleagues, many of whom have made very much the same case that Create Streets has made, like a very thoughtful, very nuanced. I think the stuff about the like more reductive approaches to this issue tend to come from outside the people, certainly from outside practitioners, and generally from outside people who really campaign on this, from wider culture warrior elements that then want to take over this issue.
No, absolutely. And I think actually we've got a paper coming out shortly. I'll give you a sneak preview by Charles Duff about Kentlands, which was the first non-resort related new urbanist development in the States. Now 35 years old, literally, I think next month. And so a friend of Create Streets visited it recently and has written an essay which we'll be publishing shortly. Yeah, that was, some things aren't quite right about it, and some criticisms you can make. But it's basically good stuff, and it's just good normal placemaking. It's some detached houses, some family houses, that's what they call it in America, and some terraced houses. The shopping's not quite right, but there's a whole ecosystem, far richer than many of us in Europe realize, of new urbanist developments, some of which are great, many of which have got some errors. It's like all human endeavors, some of which are not so good. But there is an ecosystem there. And obviously, thanks to the incredible, actually, we haven't talked about education. Consciously, we've only got a couple of minutes left, but it is probably worth just talking about the importance of education. Is that, can we move on to that? Is that?
I think that's maybe we'll have education as our final theme. What, Nicholas, tell us about the importance of it.
You can as well. You actually got a PhD, which more than I do. I mean, again, as many of the people on this call will know, the importance of, I mean, the classical tradition very, very nearly died. There are, and you can create these little links through, to Quinn and Terry and a few others you can make a link back to the to the training pre-war. But obviously, as all of the schools, Bartlett's in Paris, elsewhere, essentially threw away their plaster cast in the 1960s as the generation who'd been educated just after World War I began to die off or to cease to practice. It all began to fall through. There are some incredibly late examples of, for example, in England, of Georgian revival done into the 60s by people practicing in the 30s. I found several in Winchester where clearly there was a sort of tolerant local planning official, so far nameless to me.
The original architect at Le Plessis Robinson was François Speury.
Yes,
who was
exactly.
a
Yeah.
practical survival architect who was still alive in the, gosh, I must say early 90s when they started working on the project.
I
And
didn't know
was
that
then able
actually.
to
Yeah.
pass the
Yeah.
baton on to the architects who've taken it. Yeah, and it's,
So,
he's their version of Ray Medeiros or
yeah.
something
So
like that.
exactly. So the tendrils are there, but you know, if were it not, and most of the, certainly in the UK, the country I know best, most of the practicing architects, British architects, are essentially autodidacts or in some way have linked back to that. So obviously George Samara Smith has got a family link. Francis Terry was obviously taught by his father, Quinn Terry. Just an aside on Francis, fascinating. I mean, we work with him quite often. He's obviously been drawing classical buildings. Sorry if I make people jealous. I make myself jealous here. You know, since he was a baby, because his father was teaching him to sort of, you know, draw the, Piazza whatever from Venice when he was 3. It's almost muscle memory. I've had we did a counter proposal for Oxford Street, the Marks and Sparks aberration, which I should just quickly as an aside got 79% public support as opposed to the nonsense they're putting up. But as he was working on it with my colleague Robert and myself, you know, at our table just here actually, sort of drawing away as we added corbels and cornices and stories and doubled it up and added on. He was almost not looking at what he was doing. It was as if he sort of just, it was muscle memory. And I think he was asking Robert what he'd had for lunch. You know, as he was busy adding, so anyway, sorry, that's total aside. We're not talking about education. Yes. So look, a few links like that were, but clearly what's come, the brilliant young men and women coming out of Notre Dame have been systemically important for the revival of traditional architecture. Obviously, many of them, Tiffany Abernathy and others, now practicing in Europe, thank God. And obviously there's the school in Rome, so those links get a little bit firmer. We need to sort this problem out, though, because I think what we're discovering from our work now around the country, there are actually quite a lot of councils who want to put in place, you might say, traditional friendly pattern books and design codes. There just aren't many firms out there or individuals and practices who can respond to that or who wish to respond to it or are able to if they wish to. And there are, as we talked about, some good, you know, friendly modernists who are actually happy to have a go and I think are sincere in their desire to respond. I think there are others who are perhaps a little less able to. We've got some research going on at the moment. There's some pretty bad stuff out there responding to that. So we need to fix this. And there are obviously moves afoot in France. And there's a wave of summer schools happening. That's not enough, and we obviously are running one of them. We actually I can announce today. So we, the Create Streets Foundation, have decided, and the trustees have agreed it, over the next 9 to 10 years to create the Create Streets Institution in Traditional Urbanism and Architecture. So we're starting that process. There's also a conference happening in a few months' time. But I think we won't be able to get to the point we need to of responding to public desire for happy places unless we start having at least one, hopefully 2 or 3 schools in Europe as well as in the States. So I think that is of, you know, what comes next. That has to come next. I think we can continue to have this gentle, quiet revolution of placemaking and of bottom-up desire, but it can only go so far without, you know, the experts and the good people on this call. You know, please to all of you, I'll shut up after this, you know, teach your younger brothers and sisters and your younger friends, pass it on, because unless we pass it on, again, it's at risk of being snuffed out. Is that a fair summary, you think, Samuel?
That's a very helpful note on which to end the bilateral part of the conversation and throw things a bit open to the audience. I saw earlier that Guy Courtois had volunteered to tell us a bit about what's going on in France at the moment. So perhaps we might start with that, if that's okay for you, Guy.
Okay. Yeah, that's okay. Hi everyone. Thanks, Nicholas, for all what you said. It's very interesting. No, it's just because you were asking about what was happening in other countries, and most of you already know me, but I'm quite new in this field. I created the think tank pour une renaissance urbaine in France, and since I'm started, we've done quite a few things. We organized a big congress for mayors in France 1 month ago, and Nicolas was there. And the way I saw it is our think tank is mainly talking to mayors and politics. So I've met the Prime Minister. I spent 1 day in Italy with him to talk about urbanism. I've met a lot of mayors, a lot of deputy members and senators, because in France, I don't know about the other countries, but in France, definitely the mayors are the king in their cities, and they're the people who really can decide very easily how to change things in their cities. So if you want something to happen, the best people to talk are the mayors, and you need to convince them to change things. And if just one meeting can change things. For instance, yesterday I've met a mayor with Xavier Boll. Xavier Boll is the architect of Plessis-Robinson, one of the lead architects. And we've met a mayor yesterday, and we've been able to convince him to launch a project as it has happened in Le Plessis-Robinson. And just in one day talking with him, he was convinced. We showed him a lot of things, and he said, okay, I want to do it. And so we will start soon launching the project on the first buildings. And so it can happen very quickly if the mayor is okay to do it. So this is why in France, I decided with my think tank to address them directly. We've done other things. We've organized a big art exhibition about happiness and urbanism. This was in the city of Meudon, and for now we have like 6,000 visitors who came to that exhibition. And the idea was to explain that we don't want to talk about beauty. We want to talk about happiness, and beauty is just one of the key that leads to happiness. But happiness in urbanism is the result of many different factors like nature, safety, beauty, places where you can meet other people and make connections. And so happiness is the result of all those things, and urbanism is absolutely key in building this happiness. But we want
and Guy, would you say, sorry to interrupt, would you say that our summary of what's happening in France, either there is a lot going on, starting to go on, is a fair summary, or are we being too, the grass is greener on the other side of the fence?
I don't know. What I think that in France a lot. I think maybe we're at the beginning of a tsunami. It's my belief. Maybe I'm wrong, but I think that
a good tsunami.
Yeah, a good one.
Rather than the one that destroys everything.
Yeah, a good one.
And where the French architects, and obviously I've met some of them thanks to you, actually, Guy, thanks to other friends. I mean, see, there are English architects practicing in France. I think John Simpson's on the call, and he's doing some gorgeous work near Paris. But the French architects, where are they trained? Are they autodidacts like some of the English ones of a certain age, or are they Notre Dame trained?
I think it's the real issue. We don't have really French architects who studied classical things. So they studied on their own. And I think, I hope they don't hear me, but I think they all lack some knowledge to do really good architecture. So what we do in France is I think what they do is much better than the horrible things they build everywhere else. But it's not as good as architect will do trained at Notre Dame, like I see in England or in the US. So I think it's one of the major issue. And this is why I'm working on creating a university of traditional urbanism and architecture in France.
Yes, absolutely.
Because I think it's absolutely key. Now we have more and more mayors who wants to change things, but we don't have the architects to answer. And so
absolutely.
Guy,
forgive me. I'm keen to get other people in as well. Forgive me. I'm not trying to stop you. It's just I'm sort of conscious we haven't got not too long. But I think what you're saying is that I'm putting words into your mouth, Guy. Forgive me. I think what you're saying is that you've got to the same point we've got to, which is, I mean, I think it's perhaps easier. You sound more confident about your ability to make the political change more quickly than has been possible in the UK. But you then get to the same point of, well, there's actually only so far you can take that if you haven't got people who can then professionals who can respond to people's. No, I totally agree.
Thank you so much.
Well, no, thank you. I'm not trying to stop you guys. I love talking to you. I'm just conscious we might have other people who want to come in as well. So that's forgive me. But if we don't, we can come straight back to. I love speaking to about France. Obviously, several of you know. Are there others who do want to come in though? Just in case. Oh no. Well, that's a nice bit of Italian we're hearing, but I don't think. I think we need to mute Mario, who's now. Okay, I'm going to mute Mario. Does anyone else want to come in other than Mario's phone conversation, which we don't want to hear?
I would like to ask a question.
Yes, you're in charge, so you may.
What's the difference in between England and France? What's more powerful, the mayors or the planning officers or the planning system? Is
in England or in France?
And also, what strategies do you have to educate the planners? Because in England, as I have the experience, they are very important.
Well,
so I think I'm.
In
sorry,
principle,
Samuel,
in principle, the planning authorities in any European country are, like, certainly, I don't know, but in Britain, France, or Germany, in principle, the planning authorities in each of them are very powerful and can do a huge amount to shape the built environment. The interesting feature of France, as I understand it, although I defer to either Nicholas or Guy on this question, is partly the concentration of power in one individual, in the mayor, who leads the writing of the urbanism plan for the commune. I think there's also, I mean, the structure of local government is quite different. So the commune, which is the unit of the planning authority unit, there are about 30,000 of them in France, whereas the planning authorities in Britain are about 300. So it's much, they're hugely variable. So the 3 million people of the Ville de Paris are one commune. And so that's a very large planning authority, in fact, larger than most British planning authority. But many of them are very small. So probably that does mean you've got more scope for experimentation, and maybe it's a bit easier, you've got 30,000 mayors out there. What's your odds of being able to persuade some of those 30,000 to try something a bit different? Whereas in Britain, you've got 300 councils, in each of which authority is diffuse and fragmented across a range of different councillors, and then distributed in different complicated ways between the councillors and the officers. So that I think means that the pace and structure of change is potentially quite different. There will probably also be differences arising from the more zonal tradition of local of the way a French local plan works, and the more policy-based system in Britain. But that I couldn't speak to that with enough expertise to think. I'm not quite sure how that would play out in terms of the rise of traditional architecture.
I mean, Guy, you may want to reply. I'll say one thing quickly on England, just to bring home the power of Samuel's point. I won't say where. So a council where we're working and where the leader of the council could not be, and by the leader, that's the senior politician. That's not the chief executive. So he's an elected councillor and he heads the cabinet. He's not the mayor. And he doesn't have full executive powers, though he is primus inter pares and can obviously lead the agenda. He couldn't have been more. Anyway, in fact, he's still himself. He could not be more supportive of what we're trying to do on every level. And he was really keen for us to be appointed to do something for this town, and he wasn't able to make that happen. Just some years ago now. So I don't think that would happen. I suspect under a more mayoral system. My understanding is, though, that, and Guy, you correct me if this is wrong, is that it does nevertheless take a while to change local policy, even if it's decreed, because you can't just write a new code d'urbanisation overnight. So the mayors who tend to have effect, and this is certainly true in Plessis-Robinson, are the ones who hang around for a while. And that if a mayor's only there for 2 years, actually he or she can't do that much. Whatever he or she says, nothing really, because development takes a while. So it's the ones who get to stick for a decade or so who can really drive change. Is that fair, Guy, or is that a false understanding?
It's absolutely fair. Actually, you are absolutely right. In France, we have 36,000 mayors, and they're the people who decide what to do. So on urbanism, they're king in their cities. So it's much more easy in France compared to England to convince mayors to change, because you have 36,000 mayors. So you will always find some who share our ideas and who are okay to use those principles. So this is why experimentation in France is happening everywhere, because you will find a lot of mayors who will do those projects in their city. But as just said, Nicholas, it's obviously the time you decide a project and you launch it, it takes a lot of time. So sometimes some mayors, they will launch everything and then they will lose the following election. So everything could stop and restart again. So, but it can be in both ways. It's very interesting what did Jean-Didier Berger, he's the mayor of Clamart. He was the former chief executive of Sempro, the company who built Plessis-Robinson. So he knew everything about the process. So when he became mayor, he had already prepared everything to launch all the projects. So he launched a very, very huge project, actually maybe one of the biggest in France, called ZAC Panorama. And he launched it just after he's been elected. So the result of the project arrived before the re-election, so people could see it, and then he got re-elected very easily.
I think Mark wanted to come in.
Yes, if I may, because I mean, I think the political thing and the mayor thing, everything you're talking about is all fantastic, but we might have got the general idea. And there's just one other, I think, important thing is that, you know, we've been talking about the popular vote, what people want, and the politicians' potential sensitivity to that, and that's been driving a lot of these conversations about the mayors. But when it gets to the education thing and other aspects, whether it's the media or what some people call the establishment or the elite, it is also important to try and change what you might call opinion makers' opinions. And we have this problem, whether it's the Venice Charter, whether it's from particularly Italian intellectuals
Oh no, Italian intellectuals, we can't have that.
Well, of the early 20th century, Cesare Brandi and these people who set up this whole set of problems for a lot of people about falsification. You know, we have to be of our time. We can't falsify. We can't go back to museum. We can't live in a museum. And, you know, it's all falsification. It's kitsch, the dangers of kitsch. You know, you've got important people, critics, Umberto Eco and so on, that have a lot of attention with this. And it then gets into architecture schools, art schools. It's very easy to teach the whole thing. So I just wonder, I mean, we will be doing as a sort of little plug for a sort of event that TAG's going to be doing in June that is trying to sort of demystify or chip away at this Venice Charter and falsification thing. But I just wonder if you've got any views on this aspect, because I think it's not as important as the popular view, but it kind of feeds into it.
Samuel, you should go. You should go first. And I see my good friend Robert Adam and John Simpson. We got a panoply of luminaries joining the conversation. But Samuel, you should go. You should go first. And I've got a couple of tiny thoughts.
I think the question is how to shift the opinions of opinion formers.
Yes.
Probably very slowly, Mark. I think that's that might not be the. I mean, I think Nicholas has illustrated some of the ways in which you can do it. So there are things which people are pretty widely shared among opinion formers, values that are widely shared. So people all agree health is important. They all agree happiness, prosperity, sustainability, prosperity, and popularity to some extent. That's a little bit more a question mark one, but hard to completely disagree that that's important. So if you can bring the debate back to those things, then you can talk to people in terms of concerns that they acknowledge and they agree with, and you've got something shared to work with, and then you can achieve buy-in from a wider range of people, or at least get to the point where people are like, yeah, your approach is also a valid approach. I might not agree about everything, but there's a lot in common here. That I think is probably the best approach that you can make with opinion for. When it comes to stuff like the Venice Charter, probably going to be quite tough. I suspect, to be honest, that the best way to persuade people on that is to win out in the real world and build some spectacular, Frauenkirchen, as in Dresden, and show that it's really popular and that wider society loves it and that ordinary people just don't see what the problem is here. And then people, elite opinion will to some extent adapt itself to the facts in the real world, and the sort of institutional infrastructure will shape itself a bit around the fact that there are huge projects going on and there are big jobs to be had on those projects that are going on. I suspect you're going to struggle to, when it comes to Venice Charter stuff, you're going to struggle to start with the Italian intellectuals and work out from them. You should probably start with the big projects in the real world where you can convince that crazy mayor to rebuild that fantastic church or whatever it may be. And then the intellectuals will start to remold their opinions a bit in the light of facts on the ground. That's my guess.
Yeah,
Can I say something?
Hello, Robert. No, very nice to see you. I was going to add one thing. Why don't you go first? Because I've spoken too much already. Robert, very nice to see you.
I couldn't find a facility to put my hand up, so all I could really do was just...
No, we deliberately turned it off for you, Robert.
Okay, all right then. I want to actually follow up on a number of these points. First of all, about Europe, is of course, we talk about Europe, actually it's a whole series of complex situations in different countries. I mean, in Scandinavia, we got architecture opera, which is extremely successful. Also in Britain, I think we're quite fortunate. The traditional architecture group as a group is actually gone from a few people to really quite a lot of people, to quite a lot of young people, which is all very encouraging. I have a particular view, is that I know we're talking about architecture and traditional architecture group and so on, but actually in a broad sense it's a secondary or tertiary activity after politics and economics and social change. But I actually, in the last 25 years, and these things move very, very slowly, things have definitely changed. And making Mark's point and also Samuel's point is that I believe that things are changing, and I've watched them change over the years, but it will be very slow. I hesitate to use the word populism, but I'm going to use it because I just hesitated. Is that we can decry it, and we can there are some very unpleasant political aspects to it, but it is a phenomenon that we ignore at our peril. The idea that where you come from and what you identify with is important is actually very much a part of populism. So I think if we look in a very broad sense, things are significantly changing. And equally well, if we take, I think Georgia and Mark, we counted 16 summer schools now, one way or another, teaching traditional architecture and urban design. And John's here, for example, is dealing with one, and a number of us, I think, people are dealing with these. The numbers of people attending these are increasing, and they multiply. People from the first summer school and now have got their own summer schools, and so it goes on. So I want to think be optimistic about this, but this is moving a super tanker. Basically, a lot of people stop thinking when they're 25 anyway. So whatever they pick up at architecture college, then they're not going to bother to change it. So it will be very slow. But I just want to cast an optimistic note. In fact, Create Streets is part of it.
Thank you. That's very kind of you, Robert.
So there's one shift.
I'll stop there. Sorry.
Okay.
Can I say something? Hello. Yeah.
Go ahead, John.
Hello, John. Nice to see you.
Yes, I think the super tanker has really been turned. I would say quite the opposite. That we are. It's not going to be as slow as you think. The difference that I remember things back in 1990 and is phenomenal. Now the general opinion that is voiced is for all the things we're talking about, and it's the minority, and there's the minority voice who are talking about Venice Charter and talking about you don't hear the word pastiche anymore. Whereas in the past, in the 1990s and before that, I imagine you wouldn't have to do anything. A pastiche would be resounding as soon as you came up with a single little traditional looking element to a building. I mean, it's a very different world we're in today, and we should be extremely encouraged by all this. The general thrust is going in our direction. It's going in the right
I
direction.
think you do get, I mean, a pretty common thing with cultural changes is that they start with a small number of people who have a tough time and, take a lot of brickbats. And then they reach a certain point where they build a level of mainstream acceptability, which gets more people to do it, and then they build more mainstream, and you do get an exponential curve when they. That's in fact what happened with the modern movement in the early 20s.
It's called the bell curve. I hope you're right, John. Actually, I really do. I just would point out I have researched the number of local authorities that have got, and we don't have pastiche in their planning documents. Still there.
I'm a little.
You'll always get bastions, and there are certain areas in academia, etc., where things are much more extreme than they are in the real world. So you've got that to start with, and you will have certain local authorities which would be a bastion of modernism and anti-traditionalism. But the reality is, before, it was almost universally like that.
I'm going to jump in. We've got some questions coming in on the chat, which I think I want to. Hang on, Guy. Sorry, forgive me. I just want to just come to the. Sorry, Guy. I just want to come back to the chat because we've got some questions coming in. So someone is asking about the. Sorry, I forgot. I lost the name. Max Mulvaney is asking about the difficulty of building urban extensions at the scale that Great Streets is certainly suggesting, and quite rightly, I think, picking up that Edwardian-style homes are quite hard to do now and have a more complex supply chain, more complex detailing and arrangements. I think that's a very fair point. He's therefore suggesting that, as you can perhaps see from the chat, that we should be reconsidering some of the corporate and bureaucratic types, such as the GLC and the London County Council architectural groups. I'd say I'm nervous about that. You described them, Max, as popular. I'm not sure the data backs you up on that, I'm afraid. It is true that people were keen to move into properties that had internal plumbing and bathrooms, and that was definitely a step up, and that there was massive undersupply of housing after the bombing of World War II. I think you do need a system, both private and public sector, that is good at responding to the conversation we've just been having, to what people want, where they want to live. So I think if you have one supplier, whether that is private or public sector, taking a top-down, confident, we know best view, I think that can very easily lead to bad results, as I would argue, I'm afraid, not as a function of its public nature, but as a function of its high levels of power is what happened post-war. And I'm not sure if Sammy would agree with that. And then we've got another question from Elliot Robbie that we should also respond to.
No, I agree with that, Nicholas. I think it would have been, John and Robert and Quinlan and all the rest were able to establish themselves working in the margins of the private sector and gradually getting there. If to the extent that architecture had been nationalized and in the patronage entirely of, or to a greater extent, to the extent that it was more in the patronage of public bodies, the more difficult it would be for heterodox architects to get a look in.
I agree. Okay, well, forgive me, John and Robert, for cutting across your energy, Guy. I just want to bring in Elliot as well, who has had his hand up. Elliot, you're on screen, and you have a question about a current project you're working on as an architect student.
Yeah, so just to give a bit of background, I'm in my second year at Loughborough University, and our current project is a library and community centre in Liverpool, and we're in the one of the most deprived parts of Liverpool in Vauxhall, and I've kind of taking this project. I'm trying to create one of these, like a new town centre for Vauxhall, this part of Liverpool. And I think my two questions are, what are the most key aspects? Because we're not designing everything in the area, but I'm, hoping to be able to design the whole space and designate different bits for different parts. And I'm really keen on this idea of a community square. Central square outside this library. So what are the most important things to bring into this, and what are the best arguments to defend my decisions?
I think, Elliot, whatever happened, you deserve top marks, Elliot, for having the gumption and the shamelessness, and I say that in a good way, to ask that question when you've got at least 4 prominent classical architects with their cameras off, and various others. Who I'm sort of tempted to ask Robert or John to reply to that, or indeed Mario. Hello, Mario. It's lovely to see you. Or indeed Mark. I know Robert's turned his camera off. He doesn't want to respond to that. John, do you want to do a quick response to that before Samuel and I opine weightily, or indeed Mark?
No, I just wanted to say hello.
Oh, Mario. Hello, Mario.
Because I could.
Well, hang on, Mario. Are you going to reply to Elliot, Mario? Only if you reply to Elliot.
Come?
Only if you reply to Elliot are you allowed to say anything.
No,
that's fine. So, no, I'm afraid you're muted. No, Mario, not going to have it. We're going to reply to Elliot. John, you go. What is your reply to Elliot?
I didn't pick up the question.
What's most important for doing a urban? No, Mario, I'm keeping you off because you're not replying. What's most important for doing a new town centre in a very poor part of Liverpool, John? Enclosure ratios, street trees, simple pattern. Just in 2 or 3 words, what would you suggest Elliot looks at and what he reads so that he can get top marks in his dissertation, which obviously we all wish him to get?
Well, he's obviously got to do everything that's going to set up a community and make a community work. I mean, that's the basis of it all. Simple as that. One word.
There you go. That's all you need. So, Elliot, I'm going to suggest you look at 2 things. Look at this, which is on our website, how to make a place that's good for pubs. I think that's a pretty good way to do it.
That's right.
And we've also got a 2-pager called Of Streets and Squares, which tries to boil down into 2 pages, Elliot. If you can't find it, send an email to Georgia or Mark and I'll send it through to you. Basically about 200 pages of incredibly tedious, turgid nonsense that I wrote and tries to get into 2 pages of nice pictures. Samuel, anything you'd add to that?
No, I think the important stuff will be covered in Create Street's existing publications. Vauxhall's a pretty interesting area. It's I stayed there during Labour conference, in fact. And you've got a lot to work with in that place. Like pretty amazing industrial heritage and docks there. So, take your lead from the best of what's already there, and I'm sure you'll create something splendid.
Now, thank you, Samuel. I stopped Mario talking earlier because I did want to reply to Elliot. I hope that's of some help to you, Elliot. So, Mario, do come in now if you want to, and then we probably need to wrap up soon. And I stopped Guy coming in as well, so I don't want to sort of keep being rude to people. Mario, did you want? Apologies for stopping you coming in. I just wanted to give Elliot his answer.
Can you hear me now?
We could hear you before. We just weren't going to let you not reply.
I just want to say hello to everybody because I joined very late this meeting, so I couldn't follow the discussion, unfortunately.
I'm very sorry, but we were speaking English, which was far too fast. Both Samuel and I have a tendency to speak fast, particularly me.
Because I arrived late.
Okay, well, thank Mary. It's lovely to see you. And Guy, I apologies. You were trying to come in earlier, and I didn't let you because I wanted to get back to Elliot. Please forgive me.
No, it's okay. I just wanted to share what we're trying to do here. That could be helpful for you. Is I don't know if some of you have studied Gramsci, but the general idea of this intellectual was, when you want to change things, you need to create a global ecosystem that really change things. And that's what we're trying to do. And so the idea is just trying to answer to your question, Mark, is what we're trying to do is, if we want to do changes, we need to talk to everyone. And we need to have a strategy that will have impact on every way of the society. So here in France, I'm working with Gaston Le Borgne, and he's really good with uprising architecture. We have 4,000 followers on Instagram, 2,000 followers on Facebook. So we're trying to talk to the young people. Then I'm giving courses at the University of ESSEC Business Schools. It's on the real estate courses. And these will be all the key deciders of tomorrow. They will be in investment funds. They will be in all the big companies that will decide all the big projects, real estate projects in the future. So we're giving courses there, trying to explain them about happiness and how beauty is related to those things. So we're trying also to talk to the leaders of tomorrow. And they're not architects. They're really, financial men, businessmen. So we talk to them. Then we're talking to the politics. We created this Congress to talk to the politics. Then we're starting to talk to the architects. We're working on the summer school and trying to create a university. So and also to the medias. We've invited a lot of medias. we're starting to have, and it's the first time in France, we're starting to have TV who are talking about this issue. It's very new, and it's really happening now. So what I'm saying is that our strategy is a global strategy. We need to talk to everyone at the same time.
Brilliant.
And to do this, we need money. And to get this money, we're talking to philanthropists who are giving us money. And I'm hoping we will have soon some important meetings, but we really hope we're getting big money to change things and
so
create this new
Brilliant.
ecosystem.
That sounds like a fantastic program and a wonderful illustration of the spread of this kind of work and the building momentum around this kind of work across Europe and across the world that we've been discussing. I think we've come to the end, and indeed beyond the end of our 90 minutes. So I'm now going to have to draw us to a close with apologies to those who've got further questions. I think I will just say thank you to Nicholas for all your thoughts this evening. Thank you to those who have asked questions, brought comments, and those who've given their attention. And thank you very much to the Traditional Architecture Group for hosting us. Georgia,
yes,
Mark,
we would
anything
like
to close?
thank you back because you are our invites. Thank you both very much. It was very interesting, and indeed it should be done more on education, and the planners should be involved more on what really matters in UK. So I would like to thank you everybody, and just to let you know that the next TAG Talk is still a work in progress, but if you watch our Instagram account and other future announcement, you will know about it. So I hope to see you all on our next TAG Talk next month, and to wish you all a very good night. Thank you so much.
Indeed.
Thank you, everyone.
Right.
Lovely to see you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Samuel. Thank you, everyone.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.